All right, welcome everyone. We're in Cohort 7, the second discussion on Chapter 8. So there's a few ways we can go. We can look at Chapter 8 in the context of the book, in terms of continuous time modeling, uh, following up on Chapter 7 from discrete time modeling. Also, uh, after or just going to it, I can share some updates on continuous time modeling from this morning in the ActInf group, where we developed on the new example from the ActInf team with the Lorenz attractor and an example with a neural network. So we could talk about that and modify it in the context of continuous time modeling. Um, First, though, let us just go to the chapter. Does anyone want to just share a section of chapter 8 or any question or quote or image or anything like that?
I have a
Um,
question.
oh,
Okay, Andres, then John.
Uh, yeah, so they talk about this attractor, like this point that things tend to, but they seem to talk about it on two different levels, like one in reality and then one in the maybe the generative model, I guess. And so if you could clarify that distinction, how those work and what's their relation.
Yeah. So when you specify the entire simulation, you will have, let's just say we're dealing with temperature in the room. We could have a situation where, or just to get into this, Y is our observable. X is going to be our latent state. X dot is the rate, the change landscape on the latent state. So this is like the thermometer measurements coming in on Y and the latent state on X and the change in the temperature. Um, you could have a room with a real attractor setting. Like there's actually a variable V such that when the true latent state is exactly V, the rate of change is zero. And when the root's temperature is higher, it drops back to the point attractor and vice versa for being lower. Then you have the agent's model of the external process. That could be built to be structurally identical, like they're both dealing with a point attractor, in which point the agent's model will tend to converge pretty simply to the correct parameters. But you could also have a situation where like the real room is on a limit cycle, so it's just oscillating, or it's bistable. But the agent's belief is that there's a point attractor. So to answer it, this is just one example of attractors. There's point attractors, limit attractors, and so on. And in practice, you end up specifying the actual generative process that gives
Mhm.
rise to the agent's observations, and then you specify the agent's model of that process, and those can be structurally identical or not.
So the attractor is basically a construct of the organism in the way that you're describing it. Like it's something it would wish for, like, which may not exactly even exist there, but may be useful nonetheless. Is that
Yeah, I mean on multiple levels. There's the modeler making the temperature model of the room and possibly just choosing to use an attractor style dynamical model
Mhm.
just as a map. And then there's the agent within the simulation using heuristics or constrained families to do variational inference in, and that could be simplified on up to any point.
And but the crucial thing is that is the attractor in the agent's mind, that there's something there they're chasing, like they're trying to tune into. And at least if I'm saying, and for me, that's very relevant because I'm trying to do this like two mind uh, dialogue where like you'll have a continuous mind that's having some kind of affordance or ability, and then the attractor would be like a concept, and then that could feed into this like discrete mind, let's say. that, has connections between concepts, let's say. But so it seems like an attractor can serve as what I would call a concept, and the process of approaching that would be like some kind of skill or ability or affordance.
Well, yeah, I mean, in figure 8-6, this is like a classic
Mhm.
hierarchical architecture where the lower level is a continuous time, continuous state space model, and the higher
Okay.
level is a discrete time, discrete state space model. So it could be
Mhm.
like you have some sort of continuous time dynamic, whether it's Lorentz attractor or just some sort of oscillator. And then it's
Mhm.
like there's a discretization, let's just say into quadrants. So then,
Mhm.
even though there's this continuous two-dimensional state space at a lower level, it gets discretized into just a four-state discrete state space model
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
basically digitization. So this
Mhm.
corresponds to a variety of settings. It's really convenient for taking analog sensors and then
Mhm.
discretizing the information. It's been applied to folk psychology in terms
Mhm.
of like embodied and interoceptive processes, which are continuous in their nature, leading to
Mhm.
discretization and action selection.
Okay, good. So that it has been done. That's okay.
Cool. John, and then yeah, we can just go to any part on 8, or we can when we get to Lorenz, we'll look at kind of Lorenz 2025.
Well, this is what I wanted to talk about actually, because what I learned about the Lorenz attractor, or the Lorenz system, I should say, I learned that it was a very simple system that isn't even very good for modeling the weather. And so I'm wondering how you could use this system in like all sorts of other circumstances when it's not even that good at modeling the weather, which is what it was made for.
Yeah, great point. So I'm not sure if it was actually meant to be like the best possible weather forecasting model, though
It
Lorenz was a
wasn't.
meteorologist. But the
It,
point was the
it
simple
wasn't.
Lorenz.
It was just meant to be a simple model that captured certain aspects of the system.
Right. And kind of the breakthrough was that this deterministic dynamical model in continuous time exhibited chaotic behavior. So that showed that really simple models can have complex, chaotic,
Well,
meaning.
I don't think that was a breakthrough because, for example, Poincaré looked at systems like that around the turn of the 20th century.
Right.
Well, I think this though might have been the first use of the idea of an attractor. But my question is, if it's not useful for what it was built for, how can it be used to model even other things? Like,
Yeah, agreed. Lorenz definitely is building on different attractor concepts from Poincaré. So let me just share a little bit from ActInf. Um, this were some updates that I pushed this morning, but based upon examples that they brought in just a couple hours ago, so 6 hours ago. So yeah, it's not that the Lorenz model has just a few parameters, just here. So if you wanted performance, you might not necessarily use this exact model, but conceptually,
Uh, I'm having a weird problem with Zoom. I only see like my window like in the main screen. I can't see what you're sharing. Can someone help me with this?
maybe like right click on, uh, can you see the shared window at all?
I see something. It says Daniel Friedman's screen, but I click on it and it's very small and I can't read it.
You don't see it at all, or you
No, I,
just
I do see it, but it's very small and I can't read it.
maybe do pin, right click and pin it.
I'm right clicking, but it's not doing anything. I'll try to figure this out.
Yeah, it's all good, but just it is there. So it has these several parameters, and it's a sort of proof of concept showing how with several parameters you can get this dynamical chaotic behavior. So what this RxInfer example did today, so it's in RxInfer examples.jl in the advanced examples integrating neural networks with FluxJL. So they uploaded this 6 hours ago as a notebook, which is really useful for like web-based viewing. And then I modified it into a script and made some modifications. Um, So what this script does, we'll just look at it in the context of this notebook, and then we can go over to cursor and play around with it. So first they define the Lorenz system. This is going to be the underlying generative process. So in terms of chapter 8, so we'll kind of go back and forth between chapter 8 and this more recent work. The underlying process is the X. Y are going to be the observations that are sampled from the Lorenz system. A data set is created with noisy samples coming from this Lorenz system. So here's this image. This is kind of like the Gödel-Escher-Bach book cover. We have a three-dimensional continuous time dynamical system with the Lorenz dynamic. And then here are three of the projections onto each of the pairwise axes. So there's like, we have some insect flying around in a three-dimensional room, and these are the projections with a shadow on three of the walls. So we're using this because the noisiness and the underlying chaotic nature of the Lorenz system make it hard to find a convergent parametric estimate of the transition dynamics. So it's emblematic of complex adaptive systems like weather or biological systems that might dwell in a region and then have some kind of switching into another regime. Again, showing how that comes out from just a couple of equations which are deterministic, but the sampling from them is not.
So any chaotic system is going to be like that, right? So why Lorenz?
Yeah, because it's classic, and there are other ones. This is one with very, very few parameters. So like there's the double pendulum. There's a variety of chaotic systems to study, like empirically and analytically. And
so is this more of a metaphor?
No, we're actually studying this model. What do you mean?
Well, if you have a chaotic system and you're representing it with the Lorenz system, like that wouldn't be good unless it actually is modeled by the Lorenz system, right?
Well, you can have a toy model, right? Like you can study a toy model just for lots of reasons.
Yeah, there's the pure pedagogical element, which is like if you don't have this Lego block in your grammar, you won't have a key piece of understanding how it works in this case. And then if there's a different model that fits the data better when you're in like a data fitting situation like chapter 9, right, you might use a different model. Or
so is the reason you use Lorenz because it data fits? Is that the answer?
No, because it's like has a long history, it's simple, and it gives us an intuition on these chaotic switching dynamics with a lot of like rich behaviors from a simple underlying just a couple equations, which we can define in a few lines of code.
Okay, but so then there's like a world of active inference that works with chaotic models besides Lorenz, and Lorenz is just in the textbook. Is that the thing?
Yeah, you if you put a different model here, the rest of the notebook you could just this is just an example. So if you have a different model or you want to change how you can put a different model here. But just wait to understand what's happening in this notebook. So
a simple model just keeps things short and easier to, like Daniel said, if it's classic, then people understand there, it's easier to communicate.
yeah, and it is one of the simplest. I mean, it's just these three dimensions and three updates. Okay, so here's noisy samples coming from Lorenz attractor. Now, we want to infer the latent state given the observations. So flipping to chapter 8, we are getting observables and we want to infer neural states or latent states like in SPM, statistical parametric mapping. So kind of the precedent to FEP and active inference. You'd have like neuroimaging data as your observables and you have underlying neural activity as latent states. Okay. However, the hidden dynamics of the Lorenz system exhibit nonlinearities and cannot be solved in a closed form. One manner of solving the problem is introducing a neural network to approximate the transition matrix of the Lorenz system. So note that the notation is different in this example than it is from the textbook. So in this example, A is going to be the transition operator, and B is going to be like the ambiguity operator that maps between the latent states and the observations. Whereas in the textbook, it's like the other way around. B is the transition states in the latent space, and A is the observation mapping. Okay. Flux.jl is used as a neural network package in Julia. Here's the RxInfer probabilistic model. We could return more to this, or people can learn more about RxInfer or get involved in the project. But this is a very simple state space model with just 5 variables. First, the probabilistic model is used to extract parameters from the untrained neural network. And basically, it does terribly. Like, the untrained neural network doesn't predict the data at all. So it was just randomly initialized. And so the probabilistic state space model, also just this green line, it has nothing to do with the data. Then the neural network is trained using a free energy objective, which is how neural networks are trained. Here's just neural network training code. Then we get here, which is showing that we can use the probabilistic model, the state space model, like the explicitly defined RxInfer model, to recapitulate the parameters of the neural network. And so I took that several steps further. It's super, super exciting because this is showing a really critical design pattern, which is about fusing the complementary strengths and functionalities of the empirical data fitting, highly parameterized nature of like machine learning and neural networks with explicitly defined and constrained probabilistic models like in RxInfer. So basically, they have complementary strengths. Neural networks are universal function approximators. They can interpolate any given function, given enough training and size and all of that. However, they have high computational resources. They have challenges with interpretability and so on. They don't have genuine uncertainty estimators, all of these different kinds of limitations. Here's showing a way in which the parameters of the Lorenz can be inferred with a neural network and trained on the data, just like anything else in machine learning or just sort of computer science today. And then we can infer transition parameters within a very, very tightly defined probabilistic model, which is small enough to be defined within this app model block in RxInfer. So this is kind of, it's things have happened since 2022. This is one of them from just a couple hours ago. And it's just really exciting because it shows like you can do pure end-to-end probabilistic programming on Bayes graphs to directly fit parameters of distributions from data. And that may be adequate. That might be direct and awesome. But this is a super interesting pattern that can be added into a lot of extant machine learning pipelines, or language model pipelines, where you have some kind of reinforcement learning or neural network system, and then you use explicit probabilistic modeling on top of that to gain interpretability, genuine uncertainty estimators, and other kinds of benefits like lower compute resources for these probabilistic models. John?
Are you or is anyone familiar with Stephen Wolfram's concept of computational irreducibility?
Yeah.
So, you said that the AI model can match any function. How does that work with computational irreducibility, or are we rejecting computational irreducibility?
I
How
didn't
does
say
that?
match. I said interpolator or approximator. So yeah, like you could have whatever the actual ontological computational irreducibility is of like the weather, you can train a linear model to approximate it. It might be a terrible approximator. Your startup might fail. You might pick the wrong weather, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you can approximate with a model. So those blobs of irreducibility in nature can be approximated using statistical models. So like to take this into sort of like the halting problem, like you can't know whether a computer script is gonna like what its output is gonna be for some kinds of scripts. But you could have a statistical estimator that says, I think there's an 80% chance this script is going to halt without running it. Or, human behavior could have these elements of computational irreducibility, but that doesn't mean you couldn't make a statistical model as a behavioral scientist. So it's kind of like map territory. Like irreducibility is about the
But
territory, but you can
so, but
always make statistical approximators.
but it does it create a limit on how good the approximation can be?
Right. Like if the approximator becomes perfect, then functionally there was computational reducibility because you could reduce the underlying process to something simpler. But to the extent that the approximation is not perfect, then that computation has not been reduced. Now, whether it's in principle irreducible or just the modeler hasn't tried hard enough is a second question. But like here's an example of the advantages that you get from building this probabilistic model. So here is like on a given dimension. So just for the X value or something of the Lorentz attractor, we get a moving posterior distribution with a mean and a variance. But the neural network won't give us a mean and a variance. It's just giving us its best prediction of the location at the next step. Whereas this gives us like a moving Bayesian credible interval. So these kinds of methods are complementary. And just again, within the last hours, this has greatly expanded our toolkit because it gives us access to building probabilistic models on top of trained machine learning models, rather than needing to do end-to-end training only through the probabilistic model.
So could you maybe expand on that point, like where you said with the mean and the variance, that I guess you're getting this data coming in from a neural network, and then you're able to, you said, I think, statistically approximate that from the other end, like from top down, or?
Yeah. So like, let's just say that we have a language model and we're going to ask it, how many people live in X place?
Mhm.
And it is going to do this forward pass through billions of parameters. And then it's going to say like 11 million, 10.5 million, 13 million, 17 million. Like it's outputting these numbers, which represent in that run with that temperature, the likeliest outcome. That's how it works with sampling the likeliest outcome given some noise that's added back in.
Mhm.
We could take that sequence of observations and then fit a model that just fits a mean and a variance from the language model's outputs. So we kind of infer like the true value for its belief about the population of that region from sampling its outputs. So it still could be wrong relative to the real reality. Like, let's just say all of its training data suggested that there's this amount, but then more people are there. So this isn't to say that it's veridical in some future moments, but inferring the latent state and having an uncertainty estimator on the latent state is always going to be more accurate than any given single measurement. It's like the measurement of, if we have the mean and the variance of the height of the children in the classroom, that's always a better number to work off of than just one measurement.
And I think that's a nice example of what this whole setup is, that the statistics kind of makes this presumption that there's something meaningful that we call the mean and the variance. But the reality might be that this neural network is just all over the place, and that's just there's no really. I mean, that means nothing. But from a statistical point of view, in terms of corralling or shepherding or like just trying to, you know, get our hands around this, it's very useful, and it is practically useful, even though from a meaning point of view, it might not actually mean anything, but it suggests what a meaningful meaning would be. Like that if this is a meaning you're supposing, hey, like, is this what you're talking about? Like, is this what you mean? The machine would say, I don't know what you're talking about, but that's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. So MB, you mentioned balance. Let's just see if Cursor will bless us today. What's kind of a question that we could ask about balance and see if we could be dealing with almost this two minds paradigm of like a neural network that's fitting noisy
Mhm.
proprioceptive data from a continuous state space and then like a conscious, explicit mean and variance
Hmm.
estimation from there. But like MB, what's an example of a setting like that, or what would be a question that relates to the vestibular cochlear?
Yeah, could you help me understand that a bit better? As I'm
Yeah.
trying to follow. And yeah, you can just call me Mark.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
MB's cool for Markov blanket too,
Oh
though.
yeah, sorry, I didn't see that my my screen name is that.
The Markov blanket.
Yeah, so basically like using cursor as sort of this augmented coding setup. Just it may not work within, the 30 minutes we have here, but just to see possibly. That's what these examples are great for, is like starting with this structure and then modifying, tweaking the example. Like the neural network could be flipped out for a more sophisticated neural network. Or here in this situation, let's see if we could adapt it to study some question of interest with like a vestibular cochlear balance question.
Mhm. Yeah, so are we, sorry, specifically, so we're trying to put data into this model, is that right? Or we're trying to build a model using this program, is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. Modify this, just the architecture of this model where we get
Hmm.
noisy data from a continuous state space,
Hmm.
chapter 8. And then we're going to use a neural network to train on the parameters from this noisy state space. That could be likened to our subconscious,
Hmm.
um, you know, embodied predictive networks. And then infer parameters from a probabilistic model put on top of that neural network.
Okay, so if we're looking at some kind of data like, and tell me if I'm understanding this correctly, like postural sway, would that be one of the
Yeah.
data that we're looking? Okay.
Okay. The noisy data are coming from proprioceptive, continuous state spaces related to postural sway. And that could be like modeled as Lorenz attractor with chaotic transitions between qualitatively different postures.
Okay.
Like
Right.
a three-dimensional state space could be um the three angles of your finger. So then there's like a zone within that state space that the finger the finger's biomechanics are related. So it's like, and this again to kind of get to this, like, what's the distinction with active inference and these other neural network or other kinds of models? What would be the approach to making biomechanically realistic finger movements? Well, one approach would be we get hundreds of hours of movement of fingers and try to do end-to-end learning based upon recapitulating realistic looking videos of hands, for example. Um, but obviously, even with billions of hours of video, making images with realistic hands is still challenging. Whereas this complementary approach would be you actually have this explicit parametrically defined model of the biomechanics of the hand. And then you understand, well, here's the zones of state space within that defined model that the hand can be in. And then we'll generate images of the hand from these biomechanically realistic postures versus just trying to recapitulate the appearance from real video. And so okay, and then what kinds of question would we want to address with that kind of model?
So are you, I mean, I could say something like, one's conscious perception of threat, something like that. Would that be, is it fair to, so this is all new to me, right? But taking someone's conscious perceptions and looking at the effect on the other end of the you know entropic dimensions of their postural sway characteristics, something like that. That would be, I don't know if that's the right kind of question to ask for this type of exercise, but that would be an example of something that would be of interest.
I'd like to add a related example. Learned about when I went with my friend to his son's Aikido practice yesterday, and there was he told me about Bhagwan Zhan. So there's this martial arts. It's all about these different hand movements. I think it's like 8 different ones. So like they just cycle through them, and so you can. So it's very much like these attractors. Like you can think, okay, my hand's going to be grasping, or my hand's going to be blocking, let's say, or my hand's going to be striking. And so in each case, I kind of picture, I think they even kind of suggest that there, like if your hand's grasping, you have a particular attractor that you're projecting. And so as you move your hand, this attractor is guiding the grasping. So that in that context, you would be imagining this grasping and you would be centered on that and it would all work out. But then in this Bhagwan school based on the I Ching 8 trigrams, then you might go to, let's say, striking, you see, and then you might go to, let's say, blocking. So the context keeps changing for what is an attractor, and you're just cycling through all these attractors. It was like bot periodicity I talk to Daniel sometimes about, but I thought that was kind of curious. That wonder if like that could be connected here.
Yeah, like this was it relates to chapter 8. Like in this page on this is we did a book stream with Thomas Parr a couple of years ago, and this part right here relates to basically recurrent attractors and continuous state space model. So initially, the active inference models were more like generalized filtering. Then people wanted these sequential dynamics. So that's like dealt with in chapter 8, like cursive. So then it was like there was models where it was like the limit attractor was like a cursive letter S. So it's just kind of like drawing a cursive letter S, and the continuous dynamics were basically like the arms joint mechanics on the table. But planning on digital computers is much easier with discrete state space models. And so that is what led to these hybrid architectures where there are mixed continuous and discrete state spaces, because planning is more easily considered in the discretized setting, like a chess planner. So it's like with the 8 hand postures, it's like that there's 8 discrete options at this higher level, and then action selection, context switching, attention, which is modeled as internal or covert action, meaning it's not observable from the outside, attentional regime shifts within this discrete state space, issue a descending motor context switch such that the body engages in a different limit attractor. So it's like, raise your leg, now put your leg down. Now raise your leg, now put your leg down. So it's like there's a biomechanical continuous attractor. In that case, it would be basically like that would be the example from here. Move your point. Okay, point at the top corner of the room. Now point at the bottom corner of the room. Now point at the, point over there. Then there's this transient dynamic. A new set point is established. And then error reduction with proprioceptive feedback. No, touch your right wrist. And then, well, once you do that, the proprioceptive error is 0. When you're doing that, the top-down attentional regime, I should be expecting proprioceptive feedback reflecting that I'm touching my wrist, and the ascending proprioceptive data have no error term, and that's a fixed point. Or the fixed point could be oscillatory, like wave your arm like this. So that's like an oscillatory attractor.
Well, one thing I've come to understand is that as we so use the example of moving your arm to a point. In order to initiate, well, actually to plan and conduct that movement, there has to be sensory, I'm assuming that's proprioceptive attenuation. Is that right? And so how do you then use the proprioceptive input to understand the movement in the model when I think what we do is, and you can absolutely correct me, is we turn the precision down as we attenuate the sensory info in order to overcome the evidence, right? That I'm not moving, to use that example. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Sensory
So,
attenuation comes up in chapter 5 as well.
mhm.
But yeah, exactly. Like modulating attention. So what are the two ways to reduce free energy? There's change your mind and change the world. Updating beliefs, that's changing the mind through learning and inference, or updating action to modify the world. Okay. And what is going to control whether the agent engages in passively updating its parameters? Now, parameter updating is its own kind of action, but not gross action, or changing through action. And that relates to the attention that's paid to the ascending predictions, basically. So that is empirically observed in postural settings, as well as like saccades, which is like kind of like micro postural. I mean, it's ocular postural. That basically, in order to enable a move, if you kept high precision, like for example, on my proprioceptive is that I'm seated in a chair. So how is it that I can get out of the chair when it's like, no, and in reinforcement or reward learning, actions are selected based upon their expected reward. Whereas in active inference, we're doing direct policy inference on the likelihood of action. So it's not that standing up would be more rewarding for me. It's I expect myself to be standing up. So it's the fulfillment of likelihood rather than the maximization of reward. But how could it be when it's an obvious counterfactual? How could it be likely for me to be standing up? How could I be the kind of guy who's standing up when my veridical proprioception is that I'm not? And the answer is transient sensory attenuation makes it suppressing the proprioceptive input, enabling there to be more ambiguity of which position I'm actually in, which creates a kind of like postural liminality, which then a top-down belief, no, actually, I am standing up, or I'm on the path to standing up, can sort of get the ball rolling over a critical threshold that then action fulfillment can take all the way. That's been modeled in like situations with like hyper or hypodopaminergic cases where like somebody may have challenges initiating movement, but once movement is initiated, it continues. Or they can initiate but not complete a movement.
So it's just that transient suppression. I think that's the key, is that it was to initiate, and then you're on to at some level processing that proprioceptive feedback to help with the movement itself, right? When the movement's in process, there can't be this continuous suppression. It has to be just, I picture it just kind of as a flicker, and then you're on to the
Or as
movement, and you're
a gradient of
ah,
suppression, where like
yeah, well said.
you become more and more demanding and more certain and more precise.
Yeah, or it's like driving on a windy road, and it's like on a straight part, you want to accelerate, but then you relax off in order to update your vector. So it's like when your gaze is fixed, you want to be having high attention to the visual input. But then during eye move, volitional or subvolitional eye movement, visual attenuation occurs, which is why we don't get motor, don't get nauseous outside of like vertigo type settings with eye movements. Because when we look away, like we get this attentional blink. We're actually not accepting or paying attention to the visual input, even though photons hit the retina at the same rate during the movement of the eyes. So that's like kind of like it's like depressing the clutch on attention, shifting into a different spot, and then we re-engage the precision, and now we're like getting information from over here.
So I'd say there's good evidence for for folks who go on to have, something like persistent dizziness, is that there is not uh, good sensory attenuation with movement. In fact, there's this excessive precision that seems to be a theme among, a variety of conditions.
Yeah, that is sort of like that is what precision psychiatry and all these kinds of approaches get towards, which is like sometimes it's that there's it can be an uncertainty estimator that's too precise or not precise enough that leads to different behaviors. So it's not a question of just like moving a variable up or down.
If I was to refine that question that you kindly asked me to try to formulate, I would say something like, what are the effects of excessive tension to postural sway? Which would be the same thing that would probably occur during a perception of threat. But what are the effects on the actual sway parameters? So this just becomes this ongoing loop, and that would be, something like to use the, vestibular phraseology, like mal de débarquement, which is just like a excessive duration of something like sea legs. But I
Yeah,
don't know if that's something we could put into a model like this.
yeah, like that's kind of that is the exploratory modeling and inquiry is like, okay, so we have this model that's getting trained on proprioceptive data, so in progress. But then we could say something like, well, but let's just say somebody is acting based upon their parametric estimators of posture. What would happen if the precision was low? So let's just reduce, let's have the best fitting model, and then let's simulate movement from someone whose precision is 3 times higher or 3 times lower. And then that, yeah, Andrews, did you have a
Yeah, I wanted to jump in with an idea that may actually be related to this, but that I've been having in this situation where, let's say you have this task that you're given a triangle and you're going to put in, and you're kind of blind, but you're going to put in a little circle and you try to expand the circle until its maximum size. And you can never be perfect at that, but you try what you can. So you're given some triangle. So in the beginning, when you do a task like that, you're going to be bumping into sides or whatever. Like you don't know how to guess what would be the right maximum, the right amount to increase the radius, etc. But at a certain point, you'll get the answer or something rather satisfactory. And then I imagine there's like a replay in, let's say, in your mind to say, look, okay, this is what it took for me to do this task. But now that I know what the answer is, where the center is, I'm interested to learn from that by saying, okay, now that I know where I end up, I would replay it in my mind to do that as efficiently as possible. Like I'd make the right guesses all along the way. And so if you do the replay for the cases you've done before, you get much more efficient algorithms that you're developing. So let's say you're given a whole bunch of different triangles, and so there are different conditions and whatever. But I think this notion of and I think it goes like to the statistical interfacing that you were doing, Daniel, saying, okay, it's not a particular answer, but like you're going to get a statistical mean and a variance for like what's optimal behavior, what's optimal presumptions, like where is this center of the triangle probably most likely going to be if I'm thrown into some kind of triangle.
Yeah. Yeah. Like live
So this
stream.
this notion of replay that you would want to replay and get your optimal strategy, and then you'd want to go into a new problem with that optimal strategy and keep improving it.
Yeah. So like Livestream 51 series with Isomura et al. This is a really critical paper that
Mm-hmm.
shows that there's a monotonic relationship between the loss function used in neural network fitting and the variational gradient descent on the semantics of the Bayes graph across the blanket. And they use this post-dictive learning strategy where basically at each time point, you minimize so that factor graph with fictive causality of factors.
Mm-hmm.
So decision making to minimize the future risk. So we want to minimize future risk for the unoccurred event. And the way that's going to happen is by remembering our past sequence of actions and observations, and then reassessing what would have been the least regretful
Mm-hmm.
updated risk assessments given all that we've seen till now, or given within this sliding window of what we've seen till now. So then it's fictive causality is propagating backwards in time, in the sense of the agent is saying, if I would have done that, given what I know about this now, this is how I think it would have occurred, and using those re-entries to reduce upcoming risk.
And it can
And they
be
could be doing
happening
that
like
on a false
very, like
inference. Oh, sorry.
momentarily, like very rapidly after the final solution. So like with posture, I can just imagine, like let's say you feel wobbly and you kind of like regain your balance, but you just say, wait, like I had it all wrong. Like this is what I should have been having in my mind. And if you don't have that, you're just gonna be wobbling all the time and you're gonna fall down. But if you're wobbling a little bit and you're able to re-parameterize, well, what is my proprioceptric situation? Then you'll feel stable. That was just a momentary thing.
So somebody
You can,
said something about what?
I was just saying, you could also do that on a false inference, right? Like an over attribution of something. Like let's say you have a really and we see this in the clinic, you have a
Mhm.
really kind of fluky circumstances around a fall, that you couldn't possibly, recreate. It's sort of a one-off experience that somebody has. And then they go through the process of, it sounds like, mitigating the likelihood that that will happen again. And they do that to a level that is excessive, right? So then their subsequent movements become very constrained.
Like shuffling their
And
feet or something.
yeah, as for example, or they have a very like tight, I guess you'd say, excursion of their postural sway. So those kinds of things, and they're at the same time, there's a greater conscious, and this is what I'm interested in, is like, the conscious overtuning of precision.
Hmm.
Yeah, like I mean, that is definitely where nested models would come into play. Like an injury occurs, and then
Hmm.
there's increased attention to the pain, or there's modification, and that sets up a new attention with descending and proprioception ascending, and those can result in a new attractor with reduced mobility or whatever it may be.
And that can generalize to other postures and even probably other circumstances.
Yeah. Like again, that's sort of the toolkit, and that's where the textbook gets us. It's just like, hey, with single layer models, there's already these richness of cognitive patterns to explore. And that's what chapter 7 and chapter 8 are about. So, chapter 6 is the recipe. These are the questions to consider. Like going through these is qualitative initially, and then chapter 7 goes into the discrete time models. Chapter 8 goes into continuous time models. Chapter 9 goes into data fitting. But it's like that kind of is one structure of the process. And then it's maybe you want the single best performing model for your deployment or for your paper. Or there's also a lot of value in building these portfolios of models and looking how different features like modify uh explain different components of the variance, especially if it's going to be something involving people where there's like intersections of complex psychological phenomena. So it may not be just a single layer model, but this is some of the toolkit, and knowing what a single layer model can do helps give some of the motifs, kind of like the rudiments for building more sophisticated models. And it's an exciting day because the applicability of these probabilistic models to do parametric inference from neural network models, which are just everywhere, has increased markedly in the last like 8 hours, which is pretty fun.
To jump in, like to think of these two minds, one continuous and one discrete. And I think of like the continuous mind, you want to extract the critical points. So it could be like the peaks or the troughs, or it could be like, going up, you're tensing your muscle, and then going down, you're relaxing it. And so you have these different modes that then can become discrete. And I guess what I learned today from you was that in the other direction, it's like projecting these statistical uh, presumptions, like, oh, there's got to be a mean, let's say, there's got to be a variance that's attracting, even if they don't actually, exist in any real uh, physical sense, but they exist in a sense of trying to get a grip on what getting a handle.
Yeah. I mean, and this like to the earlier questions, like the structure of the generative model assumed by the agent does not have to be the same as the environment. The
Mm-hmm.
environment could be like a bathtub probability distribution, like it's either
Mm-hmm.
like dwelling low or dwelling high. But then the agent could be trying to infer a Gaussian. So then they could having all these pathologies where first it's super tight low, and then it's super
Right.
tight high, and then it's in the middle and it's super blurry, and it's swapping between them or it's staying in one. So it's like they're fitting ultra well when it's on the low with their high precision low estimate, but then they're completely confused when it flips to the high state. So it's like
And,
those
and,
are
and
those
it's
are the kinds of diagnostics that you want to look at to understand whether you're dealing with the wrong family of variational distributions.
And it's like you could be walking uphill for a ways and then walking downhill for the ways. Like your posture's complete. Like there's no average that make it. It's a non-concept to say there's some kind of average there because it depends on where you're walking and you don't know where you're going to be walking. But the idea that you have some kind of momentary balancing, parameters that you're kind of guessing, like they don't have to be real, but they could be meaningful, I think.
Yeah. And it comes back again to the precision modulation and attention,
Hmm.
which is just over the papers and the years is always returned to as sort of a hallmark of intelligence. You know, you want to be precise when it's good to be precise and to be open when it's good to be open. But when to do that is the question.
And that's like a third mind type of thing, balancing those two minds, I think.
Exactly. Agreed with that. Yeah, just in our last minutes, let's see how that what it will do for its second output. But anyone have any last comments or questions?
I have a question, but it's not about chapter 8. Is it possible to change your generative model? Like, are there models that change models, or yeah?
Yeah, that's called structure learning, is when the topology of the model, the structure of the model is itself modeled. So yes. Then so any other
I'm glad, John, Mark, Daniel, to hear from everybody. It was very helpful today. Thank you.
cool.
Thank you
Yeah,
for allowing me to participate and learn. This is great.
cool. Yeah, I'm also just really curious to see where this last training step will get us in the outputs. I mean, and I hope, like, again, it's not all about code, but starting with examples and modifying them and kind of staying on a ridge of functionality
Mhm.
is super powerful right now. Like you can
So Daniel,
also,
this RxInfra, you're active in this, or
it's an open source project. We have we meet weekly.
okay, you are in this.
I mean, it's Lazy Dynamics and Reactive Base are the developers, but like there's a lot of participants in the institute who also contribute, and we're partnered with them. But it just using cursor or similar methods. Again, so it isn't all about code. It's not all about reducing it to code, but this shows a little bit, and there's other places to see it as well. You can get you with one prompt, you can get pretty far, but modifying what's already functional is ridiculously powerful. So
And that's
like,
one thing that's, oh, sorry,
yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was just saying that it's becoming a bit demystified as far as that. That was the one question I had coming in is like, okay, how do you take something that's conceptual and then take real numbers and run it? And it sounds like it's kind of like, well, you just start with something and then you say, okay, what if I increase the precision here or I change the model there, right? And that's kind of what we're getting at is you just start to apply numbers in a relative sense. Is that right? If the and if even better if there are real data, but I don't know how you would give consciousness, how you would give that numbers, like attention. You just were playing with that 0 to 1 as far as the precision of within the model. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, I think like obviously consciousness, especially if it's defined as unobservable, is a perennial measurement issue and question. Um, Doing attentional modeling and more of these like just cognitive variables that aren't necessarily related to the self-awareness or a consciousness, those are more tractable. Self-report is a classic. So yeah, consciousness related modeling is often tried and very fraught.
But this is I don't mind it being fraught. So this distinction between the continuous and the discrete, and then realizing, like you were saying, Mark, that sometimes you shouldn't overthink it, right? Like you should be doing, your continuous movements. Sometimes you should. It's just like your lucky mind. When everything's going well, just keep walking. But you have the unlucky mind, like, hey, there's a hole, like don't fall in, right? So do you use your lucky mind or your unlucky mind? Um, that is what consciousness is all about. Like to make sure they have the same information and then deciding, yeah, but here I shouldn't overthink it. But oh no, here I should be careful. So I think, and see to the things we're learning, like the relation between those two minds. One is that, like, oh, let go of the brake in terms of certainty and pretend you don't know, and then tighten, 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 tighten. So that process shows you the direction of those two minds, that you're going from the continuous one that needs to be moving to the discrete one that needs to kind of like focus on some attractor. So those types of things are indicators of the consciousness in play, I would say.
Let's see if it will output the stick figure as requested. But these functions are only a couple so this could be like This is pointing and like you're having your hand waver and point at something. And then like, for example, blood sugar is related to the precision of the ability to point. If somebody's having a blood sugar crisis, they're going to have different precision of their movements. That's something that's more empirically observable. And then you could differentially parameterize more overt elements. Let's see if it did it. Absolutely hilarious.
Oh, these
True,
are stick figures?
yeah. True posture, proprioceptive, perceived posture. So that gets super interesting, right? Like there's the real body, and then there's like these ghosts of like what we predict and what is. And then you just say, okay, now modify it so that it's taking in this data instead of the simulated Lorenz data.
So
And
say
now
what are the three? The true,
true
the
posture is the red one. The
uh-huh.
proprioceptive signals are these noisier gray ones.
Okay.
And then the perceived posture is the blue one.
Oh, that's
That's
fantastic.
exactly what people describe is, at some point, okay, I realize my postural sway is normal. And that almost takes some convincing. And then, but it feels like I'm doing this. It feels, and you've probably had that experience, coming off a boat or, even sometimes transiently coming off an elevator. You perceive that excess. And for some people, there seems to be a difficulty attenuating that and returning. And to use your example, you're walking up a hill and then you're walking flat. But it's like when you made that transition, you're still in a sense like running the program as if you're walking up the hill, and now you have this conflict.
Yeah, that's the
That's fascinating. Looking at that's really exciting. It's
yeah.
a really great way to model
Cool.
it. Yeah.
It's open source. Take it and run/walk with it.
Not too fast.
Or stand and sway.
Yeah.
Standing sway
Epic
with.
though. It's epic. Okay. Thank you all. See you later. Bye.
Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much. That's
Giovanni.
great.
Bye bye.